The letter had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone soft, the paper worn thin at the corners, like something that had been loved nearly to pieces. Wren Voss held it in her lap as the wagon carried her forward across a landscape so open it made her chest ache. Not the gentle ache of beauty, though it was beautiful in its own severe way, the grass stretching in every direction, like a sea that had forgotten how to move the sky overhead so wide and so blue it felt less like sky and more like a verdict. No, what she felt was the particular ache of a woman who had traveled very far from everything she knew, and was only now beginning to understand that distance was not simply a matter of miles. She did not read the letter again. She had read it 17 times. She knew because she had counted the way a person counts things, when the counting is the only thing that feels solid. She simply held it the way she had learned to hold it, not clutching, not pressing it to her heart the way women did in the stories she used to read aloud to her students on rainy afternoons. Just holding, the way you hold something that belongs to someone who is gone. The driver up front said nothing. He was the kind of man who understood that some passengers were not traveling towards something so much as they were traveling away from the last place they had been, and that talking would not help either way. The horses knew the road. The road knew where it went. That was enough. Wren looked out at the land. She had grown up in a town where every street had a name and every name had a story, and she had known all of them. She had grown up with the sound of neighbors through thin walls and the smell of bread from the bakery 2 doors down, and the particular comfort of a world small enough to memorize. She had been a teacher there in a schoolroom that smelled of chalk and wood smoke, and the particular earnest concentration of children trying very hard, and she had loved it in the uncomplicated way that people love the life they have built carefully and slowly and with great intention. And then Marcus had gotten sick. It had not been fast. That was the cruelty of it, the slowness, the way it allowed her to know what was coming for a long time before it arrived. She had sat beside his bed through 2 seasons reading to him when he was well enough to listen, simply sitting when he was not. He had been 8 years older than her brother, the person who had stood at the back of every room she had ever entered to make sure she was safe in it. After their parents were gone when Wren was 12 and Marcus was 20, he had become the whole of her family without making a production of it, without ever once suggesting that she owed him anything for it. He had simply been there, and then slowly, he had not been. She had found the letter 3 days after the funeral tucked beneath the small carved box where Marcus kept the things he considered worth keeping. His handwriting had always been careful, the handwriting of a man who believed that words deserved to be treated with respect. But in that letter, it was less careful than usual. The letters slightly uneven, the lines not quite straight, and that unevenness told her more than the words themselves about what it had cost him to write it. Callum Reed is a man who keeps his word, Marcus had written. I have asked about him carefully, more carefully than he knows. Give him a chance, and give yourself somewhere to stand. Don't stay because of me. Only stay if you want to. She had read it 17 times, and she still was not sure what she was supposed to do with the last 2 sentences. Don't stay because of me. As if she could separate what she was doing from why she was doing it. As if motivation and action were 2 different rivers, and she could simply step from one to the other without getting her feet wet in both. She was not staying because of Marcus. Marcus was gone. She was going because of him, because the last thing he had done with his failing hands and his careful, frightened love was point her in a direction, and she could not find it in herself to refuse the pointing. Whether she would stay was a question she could not yet answer. To answer it, she first had to arrive. The wagon rounded a long, shallow curve, and there it was. She had expected something. A ranch, the letter had said. Land and cattle and a house. She had formed a picture in her mind that she now realized had been assembled entirely from imagination, something orderly, something that announced itself. What she saw instead was something that had grown, rather than been built a house that had started one way and been added to over years, a barn that leaned slightly to the east as though listening for something fencing that stretched out in both directions until it disappeared into the grass. It was not impressive. It was something stranger than impressive. It looked like a place that had decided to persist. The wagon slowed, stopped. Wren sat for a moment before climbing down the letter still in her hand. The air here smelled different than she expected. Not unpleasant, just unfamiliar, a combination of grass and earth and something animal and clean that she had no word for yet. The wind moved across the open ground with a kind of authority that the wind in her hometown had never possessed, channeled as it was between buildings and around corners. This wind had nowhere to be stopped. She climbed down from the wagon. Her boots met the ground. The ground was solid, unyielding, indifferent to the fact that she had never stood on it before. The door of the barn opened. The man who came out was wiping his hands on his work pants, the gesture of someone interrupted mid-task rather than someone who had been waiting. He was tall, not in a remarkable way, but in the way of a man who had spent his life working outdoors, and had been shaped by it broad through the shoulders, a kind of unhurried physical competence in the way he moved. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His face was the face of someone who had spent considerable time in weather. He stopped when he saw her. Not with surprise exactly, he had known she was coming, she reminded herself. More like the stopping of a man recalibrating something he had been carrying. They looked at each other across the distance of the yard. She counted the steps between them. 10, perhaps 12. Close enough to speak without raising her voice. Far enough that neither of them had to commit to anything yet. He did not smile. She did not smile. This was not, she understood instinctively, a situation that called for the performance of ease. What he did after a moment was nod. A single deliberate motion, the kind that meant I see you rather than hello. The wagon driver set her bag down in the dirt, climbed back up, and was gone before the dust of his departure had time to settle. And then it was just the two of them and the wind and the land that went on forever in every direction. And Wren Voss thought, Marcus, you had better have been right. His name was Callum Reed, and the first thing he showed her was the lock, not immediately. First, there was the walking from the yard to the house, side by side, with an arm's length of space maintained between them by mutual unspoken agreement. First, there was the brief tour of the main room, delivered in the economy of words that she would come to understand was simply his natural mode of speech. Not coldness, not unfriendliness, simply a man who did not use language as a way of filling silence. The stove, the table, the shelves where things were kept. Functional information offered without apology for its lack of decoration. Then he showed her the room that was to be hers. It was small and clean. A window that faced east, which meant morning light. A bed with a quilt that had been washed recently. She could tell by the smell of it the particular clean scent of something dried in open air. A small table. A hook on the wall for hanging things. And on the door, a lock. Not the original lock, which was still there, the older one with the key hanging from a nail beside it. This was a second lock, added recently, the wood around it still pale and unworn where the chisel had worked. A bolt that slid from the inside, a lock that meant from within this room, you decide who enters. Wren looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at him. He was standing in the doorway, taking up more of it than perhaps he realized, and his expression was the careful neutral of a man who had done something he was not going to explain unless asked. She did not ask. She understood. She simply nodded, and he nodded back, and that was the whole of that conversation. But something shifted in her chest, small and quiet, like a window opening in a room that had been closed for a long time. The first dinner was silent. This did not surprise her. She was not by nature a woman who needed noise to feel comfortable, and she suspected he was a man who would have been deeply suspicious of anyone who tried too hard to fill the space between two strangers with chatter. So they sat across from each other at the table with the lamp between them and the sound of wind at the windows, and they ate. The food was plain and sufficient. He cooked the way he seemed to do most things, practically without ceremony, in a way that got the job done and asked no admiration for itself. Midway through the meal, he stood up without a word and took the pot from the stove and added more to her plate. He had not asked if she wanted more. He had simply noticed that her plate was getting low and remedied it the way you remedy a practical problem, the way you fill a water trough before it empties rather than after. Wren looked down at her plate. It was such a small thing, such a completely ordinary, unremarkable thing. And yet, she had to take a slow breath through her nose before she could continue eating, because it had been a very long time since before Marcus got sick. Perhaps since before she understood that Marcus was going to get sick, since anyone had looked up from their own concerns long enough to notice whether she had enough. She ate what he had given her. She did not say thank you. Somehow, that seemed right to say thank you for being noticed would have been to make something small into something large, and neither of them seemed like people who wanted that. She had not expected to be awake at that hour. Sleep had come easily enough at first, the exhaustion of travel and the strange relief of having arrived somewhere of no longer being in motion. But she woke in the deep part of the night to the sound of the wind and the unfamiliar sounds of an unfamiliar house, and sleep did not come back. She sat up, lit the small candle on the table, opened the letter. She did not read it. She told herself she was not going to read it again, and for once she held to that. She only held it, turning it in her hands in the candlelight, looking at her brother's handwriting the way you look at a photograph of someone's face. Not to learn anything new from it, just to be in the presence of it for a while. The house was quiet. The wind outside was not quiet, but the house itself had the particular stillness of a place where only one person usually lived. A stillness so thorough it had texture to it. She heard footsteps in the hallway. They paused outside her door. She did not move, did not call out. There was a moment of perfect stillness, her candle flame and the pause in the footsteps and the wind outside all suspended together. Then she heard the sound of something being set down on the floor just outside her door. A soft sound, ceramic on wood. And then the footsteps moved away down the hall, and she was alone again. She waited. Then she got up, slid back the new bolt he had installed, and opened the door. A cup of tea. Still hot, she could see the faint thread of steam rising from it in the cold air of the hallway. Plain ceramic, cup-no saucer, the tea poured with the same lack of ceremony as everything else he seemed to do. Wren stood in the doorway in her stockinged feet and looked at the cup, and looked down the dark hallway where he had gone, where there was no longer any sound or movement. She picked up the cup. It was warm in both hands. She stood there for a moment longer, looking down the hallway toward nothing, and thought about a man who would get up in the middle of the night to leave tea outside the door of a woman he did not know, who would do it without knocking, without announcing himself, without requiring anything in return for the gesture, not thanks, not acknowledgement, not even the knowledge that she had found it. Who are you? She thought, really. She went back inside, sat on the edge of her bed, and drank the tea slowly. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with a sound like a long, slow exhale. The candle flame bent and straightened and bent again. And Wren Voss, who had not cried at her brother's funeral because she had used up all her tears in the months before it, and had nothing left, sat in the dark of a stranger's house in the middle of the wide open land, and felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not happiness. Not yet. Something quieter than that. Something more like the first small loosening of a knot that has been tight for so long, you have forgotten what it felt like before. Morning came the way mornings came in that country, quickly, without apology. The light arriving not as a gradual softening of dark, but as a sudden declaration. Wren woke to it and lay for a moment simply listening, cataloging the sounds of this new place, the creak of the house settling the distant movement of horses in the barn, the wind that never entirely stopped. She dressed and went to the kitchen. He was not there. She could hear him outside, already the particular sounds of someone who had been up for hours doing the work that needed doing before the day properly began. She made coffee, moving carefully around a kitchen that was not hers, yet learning the logic of where things were kept with the same quiet attention she brought to any new problem. She was standing at the window with her cup when she saw him. He was coming up from the direction of the barn, and with him was a man on horseback, a visitor arriving at an hour that suggested the visit was purposeful rather than social. The rider was well dressed in the way that men are well dressed when they want to communicate something about themselves, his coat too clean for a working ranch, his horse a little too fine. Callum stopped in the yard to receive him. She could not hear what was said. She watched the shape of the conversation from the window, the rider leaning down from his saddle, the easy, expansive gestures of a man making an offer the papers produced from a saddlebag and extended. And Callum standing still, his weight evenly distributed, his hands at his sides, listening in the complete way he seemed to listen to everything, not impatiently, not dismissively, but with a stillness that gave nothing away. Then he said something short. One word, perhaps two. The rider's posture changed. Not dramatically, he was too practiced for that, but something shifted in the angle of it, the recalibration of a man who had expected a different answer and was already adjusting his approach for next time. He tucked the papers back into his saddlebag. He smiled the smile of someone who had not finished the conversation, merely paused it. Then he turned his horse and rode back the way he had come. Callum watched him go. He stood there for a long time after the horse had disappeared, and what Wren noticed from the window, what she would think about later turning it over, was his hands. They were at his sides, not moving, but she could see even from that distance that they were not relaxed. The tendons in the backs of them, the particular set of a grip being maintained. He was afraid of something. Not of the man who had come and gone, that much she could read clearly enough. Of what the man represented. Of what the man's return, which was clearly coming, might mean. He stood there looking at the horizon for a long time. Then he turned and walked back toward the barn without looking up at the house without looking up at the window where she stood with her coffee cooling between her palms. Wren watched him go. She thought about the new lock on her door, about the tea left in the dark hallway, about the plate refilled without asking, about a man who communicated entirely in actions and never, it seemed, in words. And she wondered what it meant that his actions so far had all said the same thing. You are safe here. You are considered here. You matter here. Marcus, she thought again, not reproachfully, not with grief, but with the slightly exasperated affection of a woman addressing someone who is no longer there to answer back. What exactly did you get me into? But even as she thought it, she knew the answer was more complicated than the question, because the honest answer, the one she was only beginning to be able to look at directly, was that she did not yet know. And not knowing for the first time in a very long time did not feel entirely like a bad thing. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. The land went on in every direction, indifferent and enormous, and strangely beautiful. And somewhere in the barn, a man who kept his word and locked her door and left tea in the dark was doing the work of a day that would end and be followed by another day and another. After that, each one the same and each one different, stretching forward into a future that had not yet been written. Wren picked up her cup, went to find something useful to do. That was how it began. Act 2. The Testing. The first week passed the way first weeks in unfamiliar places tend to pass slowly at the edges and quickly in the middle, each day feeling both endless and abbreviated each night, bringing the strange relief of having survived another stretch of newness without catastrophe. Wren learned the rhythms of the ranch, the way she had always learned things, by watching first, then doing, never asking for more explanation than was strictly necessary. She had discovered long ago that most things revealed their logic if you gave them enough time and attention, and that asking too many questions too early was often less efficient than simply observing and waiting for the pattern to emerge. It was the boy who gave her the opening. His name was Pip, and he belonged to the family of the ranch's only hired hand, a quiet man named Walt, who worked from first light to last with the particular dedication of someone who understood that the work was the thing. Walt's wife had died some years back, and Pip, 8 years old, and serious in the way that children who have lost a parent young tend to be serious, carrying the weight of it in a particular stillness around the eyes, had grown up on the edges of working places, learning the world the way ranch children learned it, practically, physically, and largely without books. Wren found him one afternoon sitting on the fence rail near the barn, staring at a worn school book with an expression she recognized immediately. It was the expression of a child who wanted very badly to understand something and had not yet found the way in. She sat down beside him on the fence rail without asking permission. He looked at her sideways. She did not say anything about the book. She simply said, "What are you stuck on?" He showed her. It was a word problem, the kind that seemed simple, and wasn't the kind that required a child to hold two ideas in their head simultaneously and understand the relationship between them. She walked him through it, not by explaining the answer, but by asking him questions until he found it himself. And she watched his face do the thing that she had spent years watching. Children's faces do the slight widening of the eyes, the small catch of breath, the moment of arrival. The next day he appeared at the kitchen door after his work was done, and sat at the table, with his book, not asking, simply arriving the way children arrive when they have decided a place is safe. Wren set a glass of milk in front of him without comment, and sat across from him, and they worked through 2 more pages before Walt came to collect him for supper. But that evening, When the supper dishes were cleared, and they sat in the main room, in their customary near silence, Callum looked up from the harness he was mending and said without preamble, "You like teaching." It was not quite a question. It had the shape of an observation being offered as an opening, the way a man who is not practiced at conversation sometimes offers a statement when he means to ask something. Wren looked at him across the room. "That's the first thing you've asked me about myself." He was quiet for a moment. The lamp between them put warm light on the side of his face and left the other side in shadow. "Is it?" Another silence. Then, "Do you like it?" "Very much," she said. "It's the only work I've ever done where you can watch someone understand something that they didn't understand before. Watch it happen right in front of you." She paused. "Most things you work at and the results come slowly or not at all or in ways you can't see. Teaching is different. Sometimes you can see it happening in real time." He considered this, turned the harness in his hands. "Pip's a smart boy." "Yes," Wren agreed. "He is." They said nothing more about it, but he sat at the table for 15 minutes longer than usual before going to bed, and she noticed, and she stored the noticing away with the other things she was collecting about him, the small accumulating evidence of a man who was in his own very quiet way paying attention. The hen that had gone off laying was the first real test. Wren had noticed it without saying anything, the way she noticed most things on the ranch, before saying anything, cataloging, assessing, waiting to understand the full shape of a problem before attempting to address it. The hen was eating normally, drinking normally, but producing nothing. And when Wren examined her, she found what she suspected: an infection, low-grade but persistent, the kind that could be treated with the right preparation. She went to the shelf where she kept her small collection of dried herbs brought from her own stores when she packed. She had learned about medicinal plants the way she had learned most practical things, from books first, then from years of careful application on plants in her own small garden, then from reading about what she grew and growing what she read about, until the knowledge became the kind that lived in the hands rather than only in the head. She made a preparation, mixed it into the hen's feed, and said nothing to anyone. 3 days later, the hen was laying again. Walt mentioned it to Callum in passing, not knowing Wren had done anything, simply noting it as a thing that had changed. Wren was in the kitchen and heard the brief exchange through the window. She heard Callum's voice say something she could not quite make out, and then Walt's boots on the porch steps going away. A moment later, Callum appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at her. She looked at him. "The hen," he said. "She had an infection. Minor. I treated it." He leaned his shoulder against the door frame. "With what?" she told him. He listened in the complete way he listened to everything, and she could see him filing it, not skeptically, not with the slight condescension of a man being told something by a woman, but with genuine attention, the way a person takes in information they find useful. "Where did you learn that?" "Books mostly. And practice." She turned back to the stove. "I had a garden for years. You learn what grows where you are and what it's good for. It becomes second nature after a while." He was quiet for a moment. "Is there anything out here that grows that way? Anything useful?" She looked at him over her shoulder. "I've been wondering the same thing. I've been meaning to walk the land a bit, if you don't mind." Something shifted in his expression just slightly, just briefly. The almost imperceptible loosening of a man who has been holding himself carefully and relaxes by a single degree. "You can go where you want," he said. And then, after a pause that was just long enough to be deliberate, "I'll show you the east side tomorrow. There's a creek. Things grow along it. It was, she understood, an invitation, delivered in the manner of a man who did not often issue invitations, and was not entirely sure of the protocol. "All right," she said. "Tomorrow." The east side of the ranch was different from the part she had seen from the house and yard. The land dropped slightly there, falling away toward the line of trees that marked the creek, and the change in elevation changed everything else: the quality of the light, the density of the growth, the smell of the air, which was cooler and damper and carried with it the particular scent of moving water. They walked without talking, which by then she had come to understand was simply how he inhabited space, not because he was withholding, but because he was present, actually present in the way that people who are comfortable with silence tend to be present. He was not somewhere else while his body walked beside her. He was here noticing things, his eyes moving across the land with the practiced observation of a man who had spent years reading a landscape the way other people read books. She found yarrow along the creek bank, plantain, a variety of willow she recognized but had not expected to find here. She crouched down to examine each one, and he crouched beside her without being asked, and she explained what she was looking at and what it was good for. And he listened, and once she looked up from the plant she was examining to find him watching her face rather than the plant. He looked away immediately. She looked back at the plant. Neither of them mentioned it. The visit from Bet Hargrave happened on a Thursday, announced by the sound of her wagon from a quarter-mile away. A woman who drove as Wren would come to understand the way she did everything else, with complete confidence and no regard for whether anyone was ready for her. She pulled her wagon into the yard, climbed down without waiting for assistance, and looked at Wren with the frank and unhurried assessment of a woman who had seen enough of the world to feel entitled to form an opinion of it promptly. "You don't look like you're staying," she said. It was not said unkindly. It was said the way Bet apparently said everything as a statement of current observable fact offered without particular investment in whether the observable fact changed. Wren met her gaze. "I suppose that depends on what I find worth staying for." Bet looked at her for another moment, then made a small sound that might have been approval or might have been simply the sound of a woman reserving judgment, and went inside to sit at the kitchen table and drink the coffee Wren poured without being asked. Callum stood near the door with the slight wariness of a man who knew this particular visitor well enough to be mildly unsettled by her presence. Wren answered everything directly without embellishment, without apology. She was from the East. She knew how to teach and how to keep a house and how to stretch a limited supply of medicinal herbs further than most people would think possible. She had not come with expectations so much as she had come because she had been pointed in a direction by someone she trusted. "Who?" Bet asked. "My brother." A silence. Bet's expression did not change in any dramatic way, but something in it settled, became something slightly less like assessment and slightly more like recognition. She said. And then, without transition, "Can you bake?" "Callum can't. His bread comes out like river rock." She did not look at Callum when she said this. "You'd think a grown man would have learned by now." Callum said nothing. He appeared to be studying a point on the wall slightly above Bet's head. Wren looked at him. He did not look back. But she saw very briefly the flicker of something at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. The shadow that a smile leaves behind. When Bet left, having drunk 2 cups of coffee and offered no compliments on them despite drinking them to the last drop, She paused at the door and looked at Wren one more time. "You'll do," she said. It had the tone of a verdict delivered after long deliberation. Then she climbed up onto her wagon and drove away the same way she had arrived, with complete confidence and no ceremony. Wren stood in the yard watching the wagon go. From behind her, Callum's voice, "She doesn't say that to most people." "What does she say to most people?" "A beat." "Nothing. She just leaves." Wren turned to look at him. He was looking at the retreating wagon with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the almost expression, the face of a man feeling something he was not going to name. She went back inside. That evening, without fanfare, she made bread. She set a loaf on the table at supper. He broke off, a piece, chewed it slowly, and set the rest of it down with the careful deliberateness of a man exercising restraint. "Good," he said. It was the first time he had said that about anything she had made. She did not look up from her plate. "Thank you." But she was smiling, turned down toward her supper, and she did not try very hard to stop it. She found the ledger on a Tuesday, not by snooping, but because she was reorganizing the shelf where the household papers were kept. And it was simply there among them, its cover worn to softness by years of handling. She did not open it. She stood with it in her hands for a moment, feeling its weight, and set it back on the shelf. But later that week, when Callum was out with the cattle, and the house was entirely quiet, she came back to it. Not to pry, she told herself this honestly and believed it, but because she had seen the number written on the outside in his careful hand, and the number had told her something that his face had told her already, that the ranch was not in crisis. Not exactly, but was being maintained at a margin slimmer than it appeared from the outside. The difference between a place that was surviving and a place that was thriving was the difference between those two things, everywhere invisible, until suddenly it wasn't. She held the ledger and thought about what she had seen in his face when Silas Morrow rode away that first morning. The tight hands, the long look at the horizon. But she began to pay attention to a different kind of thing after that. The small economies of the ranch, the places where the margin showed itself in how decisions were made and what was deferred and what was not. She was good with numbers. She had always been good with numbers, had done the accounting for the school where she taught until the school could afford to hire someone, for it had kept Marcus's small household accounts in perfect order through years of careful management. She could read a financial situation the way she read a text she was preparing to teach, looking for the structure beneath the surface, the logic that explained the choices. The night that changed something between them began with rain. It came in the late afternoon, building from the west with the particular speed and thoroughness of storms in open country, where there is nothing to slow them and nothing to hide from them. By evening, it was driving hard against the windows, and the temperature had dropped enough that the fire needed feeding more often than usual. Wren had taken out a book, one of the two she had brought with her, a natural history that she had been using partly for pleasure and partly for research into what grew in this part of the world. Callum was at the table with the harness that always seemed to need attention, or perhaps with a different harness, or perhaps it was simply the thing his hands needed to be doing when he was in the house. The rain made the room smaller. Warmth from the fire. The smell of wet earth coming in around the window frames. The sound of it steady and complete, filling every silence from the outside, so that the silences inside took on a different quality, more contained, more deliberate. After a while, Wren set her book down. She had been thinking about what she wanted to ask for several days, turning it over, finding the right angle of entry. She was not a woman who asked questions carelessly, not because she was afraid to ask them, but because she understood that some questions changed things, that the asking of them was itself an event, and that you could not unask a thing once it had been put into the air between two people. "Why did she leave?" she said. He did not ask who. He put the harness down, the rain against the windows, the fire settling. "She said I loved this land more than I loved her," he said at last. His voice was the same as it always was, low, unhurried, giving nothing away on the surface, but she had been learning to hear what was beneath the surface. She might have been right. I don't know. Do you think she was right? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "What I know is that when she left, it hurt. And when I woke up the next morning and looked out and saw the land still there, I knew I still had a reason to get up." He paused. "I've never been sure what that says about me." Wren looked at him across the room in the firelight with the rain coming down outside. "It says that you know what you love," she said. "That's not a failing. Most people spend their whole lives trying to figure that out." He looked at her then directly with the full attention he usually parceled carefully. She thought it was a failing. She was telling you what it felt like to her. That's not the same thing as what it was. A long silence. He picked up the harness again, but did not work with it. Just held it. "What about you?" he said, and she understood that this was significant, that this was him attempting the thing he had told her first about himself, offering it back as a kind of reciprocity. "What did you leave behind?" She had been expecting this. She had known it was coming and had been preparing for it, deciding how much to say, finding the shape of it. But what came out was not the prepared version. She told him about Marcus, not the abbreviated version she gave to people who asked politely and did not particularly want to know the short version, the appropriate version, the version that answered the question without requiring the listener to hold very much. She told him the real version, the 8 years of age between them, and what those 8 years had meant, the way Marcus had become her family so completely and so quietly that she had never had to think about it until he was gone. She told him about reading aloud to him in the evenings, the particular books he liked and the ones he pretended to like, and the ones he fell asleep during with the loyal expression of a man determined to seem interested. She told him about the 3 days at the end when they didn't talk much because there was nothing left to say that hadn't been said, and how the not talking had been its own kind of completeness. Her voice did not break. She had rehearsed this story enough times in her own head that the breaking point had been worn smooth. But her hands, which were folded in her lap, tightened briefly, and she knew he could see it. When she finished, the rain was still coming down. Callum was looking at her with the expression of a man who has been handed something he understands the value of and is holding it carefully. "He must have loved you very much," he said. "The simplicity of it, the directness, no performance of sympathy, no reaching for comfort, just the plain acknowledgement of the thing she had said." Wren felt her eyes go warm in a way she had not expected. "He did," she said. "And I could be furious with him for making decisions I didn't ask him to make, and love him for making them for exactly the right reasons at the same time." She paused. "I suspect I'll be doing both of those things for the rest of my life." Callum looked at the fire. "Loving something you also want to argue with," he said quietly, "even when it can't hear you anymore." "Yes," Wren said, "exactly that." They sat with that for a while, the two of them, and the fire and the rain and the things they were each carrying held not at arm's length now, but simply present acknowledged, given the room to exist without being fixed or explained away. It was not a moment of arrival. It was something smaller and more durable than that. It was the moment when two people who have been in the same house for weeks first become, in some wordless but consequential way, present to each other. When she went to bed that night, she did not take the letter out of its place in the small carved box. She simply lay in the dark and listened to the rain slow, and then stop, and thought about the way he had said he must have loved you very much, the plain certainty of it, as if he had assessed the evidence and reached a conclusion that required no qualification. She thought about that for a long time. Outside, the storm moved on. The land absorbed what it had been given. And in the morning, the sun came back, as it always did in that country, without apology, without gradation, arriving all at once into a world that had been washed clean and was waiting to begin again. The second visit from Silas Morrow came on a morning when the sky was so clear it looked painted. He arrived with a different manner than the first time, less the opening move of a negotiation, and more the continuation of a man who had given his opponent time to consider and was now returning to collect the response he expected. His coat was clean again. His horse was fine again. And the number he produced this time, written on the paper he extended to Callum in the yard while Wren watched from the window, was larger than the first. She could not hear the conversation. She watched Callum's body instead, the set of his shoulders, the angle of his head, the stillness that was not the stillness of a man who was at peace, but the stillness of a man working very hard at appearing to be. Callum spoke. Whatever he said was brief. Silas Morrow looked at the house directly at the window where Wren stood. She did not move. He held her gaze for a moment with the neutral appraisal of a man filing information, then looked back to Callum said something and rode away. Callum came inside without looking at the window. He moved through the main room and into his small office and closed the door, not loudly. Simply closed it. The quiet click of a man who needed to be alone with something. Wren stood in the kitchen for a while. Then she made coffee. She poured 2 cups and carried them to the office door and knocked once lightly. A pause, then, "Come in." He was sitting at the desk, not doing anything, just sitting, the particular posture of a man who has been very still for a moment too long. She set 1 cup in front of him without comment and took the chair near the small window with her own. He looked at the coffee, then at her. "He came back," he said. "The number's higher." She did not ask what the number was. "Do you want to sell?" The question landed in the room and stayed there. He looked out the small window at the land beyond, the grass, the sky, the long, familiar sight of a place that had been the whole of his life, for long enough that he could no longer see it with any objectivity, only with the particular blindness of deep attachment. "No," he said, but the word came out slower than it should have, weighted with something. She looked at him. "But you're considering it." He picked up the coffee cup, set it down. "If a man considers something long enough," he said carefully, "it's usually because he's trying to find a reason not to do it, trying to out-argue the part of himself that already wants to." Wren held her cup in both hands. The office was small, and the morning light came in sideways through the single window, and the space between them was close enough that she could hear the change in his breathing when he stopped performing steadiness and simply let the weight of the thing settle. She thought about the ledger, the number on its cover, the slim and careful margin. She thought about a man who had gotten up in the night to leave tea outside the door of a woman he didn't know, who had installed a lock she never asked for, who had crouched beside her at a creek bank and learned the names of plants because she knew them. She thought about the letter in her carved box and the words she had read 17 times and had finally, she thought, begun to understand. Don't stay because of me. Only stay if you want to. Callum, she said. He looked at her. You're not going to have to out-argue it alone. He was quiet for a long time. The light moved through the window. Outside somewhere far off, a meadowlark called once and was answered by nothing. What does that mean? He said at last. Not challenging, genuinely asking. She looked at him steadily. It means that I'm here, and I'm not yet sure what that means either. But I know it means I'm not someone you have to carry this alone in front of. He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved across his face too briefly to name too complex to reduce to a single thing. Then he picked up his coffee, looked out the window, and said nothing. But the set of his shoulders was different after that. Just slightly. Just enough. And Wren sat in the chair by the window and drank her coffee and let the silence be what it was, not empty, not waiting to be filled. Simply the silence of two people sitting with something real between them, no longer pretending it was not there. That, too, was a beginning. Act 3. The deepening. The writing lessons began practically the way most things between them began, as a necessity, dressed up as nothing more than that offered without romance and accepted without ceremony. Wren had said, all right, in the tone of a woman who understood perfectly well what was being offered, and had decided to accept it on exactly the terms it was presented. The first lesson, she fell twice. The first fall she got up quickly, which she could see was the right response from the way Callum's expression did not change. The second fall, she got up more slowly, because something in her hip had connected with the ground harder than intended, and she took the extra moment not to be dramatic about it, but simply to assess whether anything was broken. Nothing was. She got up. Callum said nothing about either fall. He simply waited for her to remount in the unhurried way he did everything with the patience of a man who understood that competence was acquired rather than arrived with, and had no particular impatience with the process of acquiring it. What he did the third day was reposition her hands on the reins briefly, matter-of-factly, his fingers closing over hers for just a moment to demonstrate the correct angle. He was already looking at Thursday when he did it. His attention was entirely on the horse, on the technical problem of grip and contact, and Wren's attention was supposed to be there too, and mostly it was. She was aware of his hands, the roughness of the calluses on his palms, the particular warmth of them, the precision of how he placed her fingers, and then let go. All of this happened in the space of approximately 3 seconds and was entirely practical. And when he stepped back to his position beside Thursday, she looked at the reins and adjusted her grip and said nothing. By the second week, she could ride the length of the east field and back without incident. By the third, she could manage a canter. On the morning, she rode out to the creek alone and came back without having thought consciously about what her body was doing when the riding had become automatic enough that her mind was free to simply be in the land rather than managing the being in it. She came through the gate and found Callum leaning on the fence post, watching. She pulled up beside him, slightly out of breath. The kind of exhilaration that physical competence produces, the particular pleasure of a body that has learned something new. He looked at her for a moment. "You've got it now," he said. Not effusive, not congratulatory, just an assessment delivered straight, the acknowledgement of a fact. But his eyes, she had learned, said things his voice did not, and his eyes in that moment said something she felt in the center of her chest before she had time to name it. She dismounted, handed him Thursday's reins, and went inside to start the midday meal. She was smiling when she closed the kitchen door, and she let herself because no one was there to see it. The thing about the ledger could not wait forever, and they both knew it, though neither of them said so. Wren had been thinking about it since the morning in his office, since the conversation that had ended with, "You don't have to carry this alone in front of me." She had been thinking about it in the particular way that practical problems demanded to be thought about, not catastrophizing, not minimizing, but turning it over carefully from every angle until she understood its real shape. She waited for the right moment, which turned out to be an evening when the work was done and the dishes were cleared, and the particular quality of the light through the windows had that end-of-day amber softness that made the main room feel smaller and warmer than it was. She brought the ledger to the table. He looked at it. He looked at her. "I didn't read it," she said. "I saw the number on the cover. I've been thinking about it since." A silence. She had expected something defensiveness, perhaps, or the particular stiffness of a proud man being confronted with evidence of difficulty. Instead, he simply pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "What did you think?" he said. She had not expected that, either the directness of it, the willingness to have the conversation without preamble. She recalibrated. "I think you're managing it carefully, intelligently." She set the ledger on the table between them. "I think the margin is slimmer than it needs to be to withstand another offer from Morrow, and I think you know that." He was quiet. Outside, the last light was going from the sky. "I've been keeping accounts since I was 15, she said. "I know how to read them. I know how to find where things can be tightened and where they can't." She met his eyes. "I'm not offering to fix something that isn't mine to fix. I'm offering a second set of eyes, if you want it." He looked at the ledger, then at his hands flat on the table, then at her. "Why?" he said. It was a genuine question, not a challenge. He was asking because he genuinely did not know, because the logic of a woman who had arrived from elsewhere to fulfill a contract offering help that went beyond the terms of that contract was not immediately legible to him. Wren considered the honest answer. "Because this is where I am," she said, "and I don't know how to be somewhere without being useful to it. And because..." She paused, finding the right words carefully, the way she had learned to with him, "because whatever this is, whatever we are to each other, I don't want to be the person in the house who doesn't know what the house is managing." He was very still. "You want to know," he said. Another pause. Then he reached across the table and opened the ledger himself, and they sat there in the amber light while he walked her through it, not the abbreviated version, not the face-saving version, but the real one. And she asked questions, and he answered them. And somewhere in the middle of the second hour, the lamp needed trimming, and they both reached for it at the same time, and stopped when their hands nearly met in the air above the table. And then by mutual unspoken decision, she trimmed it, and he continued reading the column of figures he had been on. When they finished, the night was full dark outside, and the fire had burned low. "The east pasture," Wren said. "You're underusing it. The fencing needs work." "What kind of work?" he told her. It was less than she had expected, a sustained effort over 2 weeks, the kind of thing that had been deferred because there was always something more immediately pressing. She thought about this for a moment. If the pasture were fully usable by early spring, she said, what does that change? He did the arithmetic in his head. She could see him doing it, the slight shift of focus that meant he was running numbers. When he came back, his expression had changed in the way it changed when he had arrived at something he had not fully looked at before. Enough, he said. Then that's where we start. He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, the ledger between them, the fire low. The land outside dark and immense, and his still his, because of a series of careful decisions and a margin that had held. It was, she thought, the closest thing she had heard him say to thank you. The evening it shifted, not dramatically, not with any announcement, but shifted the way a season shifts, which is to say gradually, and then suddenly, and then irreversibly, began with rain again. She would think about this later. Rain seemed to be the weather of their real conversations, as if the ordinary routines required different conditions to open. Pip had been sick for 3 days with a chest cold that was unpleasant but not dangerous, and Wren had been managing it with a preparation she made from what she had found along the creek bank combined with what remained of her brought stores. The boy was improving. His color was better. His appetite had returned, which was always the clearest sign. She had been in and out of Walt's small cabin all day, and it was late by the time she came back to the main house later than usual. The kind of lateness that meant supper had been past for an hour, and the house was quiet, and she expected to be alone in the kitchen with whatever she could assemble quickly. Instead, she found Callum at the stove. He had kept food warm for her, not announced it, not waited at the table, simply kept a plate warm on the back of the stove and left it there. He was at the table with a book when she came in the lamp beside him, and he looked up briefly when she entered, and then back at his book in the way of a person who has decided in advance not to make a production of the thing. Wren stood in the kitchen for a moment, still in her coat, looking at the plate on the stove. She took off her coat. She ate standing at the counter, too tired to sit, too grateful for the warmth to do anything that required more effort than lifting a fork. He read his book. The lamp put its light on the pages and on his face and on the kitchen around them, and the rain came down outside, and she ate the food he had kept warm for her without either of them saying a word about it. "How is he?" Callum asked eventually, not looking up. "Better. He'll be fine." "You've been there all day." He needed someone to be there. She set down her fork, looked at his profile. "You were like that when you were sick, weren't you? Alone." He turned a page. "What makes you say that?" "Because you keep food warm for people who are tired. People learn to do that because someone once didn't do it for them." A long silence. He closed the book. "There's no virtue in needing people," he said finally, not defensively, just the plain delivery of a belief he had held for a long time and had perhaps not examined recently. "There's no virtue in not needing them either," Wren said. "It's just a habit, sometimes a useful one, sometimes not." He looked at her, the lamplight, the rain. "My wife used to say I'd built walls so high I'd forgotten there was anything on the other side of them." Wren looked back at him steadily. Were the walls there when she came, or did they go up while she was there? The question landed. She watched him sit with it, not flinching, but genuinely considering doing the honest accounting of a man who was capable of it when he was willing to try. "Both," he said at last. "Some were there before. Some," he stopped, looked at the table. "Some went up after, when I understood she was going to go. You built them before she left so it would hurt less when she did." He said nothing, which was the same as yes. Wren sat down across from him. The table between them, the lamp between them, the distance between them that had been closing so gradually, neither of them had been able to name the moment it started. "That's not walls," she said. "That's just being afraid. Everyone does that. You don't seem afraid of much." "I'm afraid of plenty." She held his gaze. "I'm afraid of caring about something and then losing it. I've had practice at the losing part. It doesn't make the caring less frightening. It makes it more." He was very still. "Then why?" he said, and she heard something in his voice she had not heard before, something that was not his usual careful steadiness, but the thing underneath it, the thing the steadiness had been built to contain. "Why do you keep—" He stopped, started again. "Why did you stay?" He did not mean why had she stayed on the ranch. They both knew that. He meant the other kind of staying, the incremental daily chosen, staying the kind that was not required by any contract. Wren looked at him for a long moment. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I know that I keep finding reasons. And that's different from before, when I was only looking for reasons to go." The rain, the lamp, his face in the light doing the thing it rarely did, letting her see it. "Wren," he said, just her name. He had not used it often. They had not in general used each other's names the way people who were comfortable with each other did. This was the third time, possibly the fourth, and each time it had the quality of something being decided. But he looked away, back at the table, back at the closed book, and whatever had been rising in him receded without arriving. She watched it go. She did not try to stop it. Some things needed to be approached slowly, and she had learned by now that he was one of them, that the approaching itself was part of it, that patience was not the waiting for the real thing to begin, but the real thing itself. "It's late," he said. "It is." She agreed. She got up, cleared her plate, and went to bed. She lay in the dark and listened to the rain and thought about the way he had said her name, and thought about the ledger open on the table between them, and thought about 3 seconds of hands on a bridle, and thought about the long accumulation of small things that were not small. She thought something is happening here. And then for the first time, she let herself think the rest of it, something I did not come here expecting. Something I would not undo. The morning Silas Morrow came for the third time. The sky was a brilliant winter clear blue that made everything look more vivid than it was, the kind of day that could trick a person into a false sense of openness and possibility. He did not go to Callum. He waited until Callum rode out with Walt toward the east fence, the fence they had been working on, the fence that was changing the margin, and then he rode into the yard and asked for Wren. She came out onto the porch. She looked at him in his clean coat on his fine horse, and she recognized the type immediately, had been recognizing it since she was a girl, reading the world with the careful attention of someone who understood that the world would not explain itself, the kind of man who had learned to look like everything was on the level so that you would not notice the moment it wasn't. "Mrs. Reed," he said. He used the name deliberately, the way some men used a woman's married name, not to acknowledge her, but to place her. "Mr. Morrow," she said. He smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind assembled from components warmth. Here, reasonableness; there, a thin layer of regret applied on top. "I wonder if we might speak frankly." "You may speak however you like," Wren said. "I'll tell you whether I think you're being frank." Something shifted in the practiced smile, a slight recalculation. He produced papers from his saddlebag, different papers than the ones she had seen before, more official looking, and began to talk. She listened. She was good at listening in the way that she was good at most things that required sustained attention. Without reactive emotion, she could hear what a person was saying and simultaneously hear the architecture of why they were saying it and track the gap between the two. And this was what she was doing now, standing on the porch, with her arms at her sides while Silas Morrow explained in the language of reasonableness and inevitability that the land was going to be bought regardless, and that the only question was whether the Reeds would benefit from the sale or be disadvantaged by the inevitable outcome anyway. He said, "You're a practical woman. I can see that. You know what a fresh start can offer someone who's been handed a hard situation." He was implying something about the ranch being a hard situation she had been handed. He was implying a sympathy he did not feel. He was also, she noted, implying that she could be separated from Callum's decision by an appeal to her own interest. She looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Morrow," she said, "I appreciate that you've made a long ride. But I want to make something clear to you because I think you've misunderstood the situation." She stepped forward slightly on the porch, not threateningly, simply claiming her ground. "This is not a hard situation I've been handed. This is my home, and my husband's decision about it is not separate from mine." Morrow held her gaze. The practiced smile was completely gone now. "The other ranchers have sold," he said. "Then you don't need this one." A long pause. He looked at the papers in his hand, then at her. Something moved through his expression that was not quite respect, but was adjacent to it, the acknowledgement of a man who has encountered an obstacle he had not adequately prepared for. "Tell him the offer stands," he said. "It won't stand forever." "I'll tell him," Wren said. "Good day." She went inside before he had turned his horse. She stood in the kitchen with her hands flat on the table and breathed. Not from fear, she had not been afraid precisely, though she had been aware of the moment in the way you are aware of any moment that matters. She breathed because something was becoming clear to her that she needed to hold still long enough to see. She was defending this place. She was standing on this porch and saying "my home," and meaning it not as a performance, and not as the fulfillment of an obligation, but as a plain and accurate description of how she understood herself in relation to this piece of ground. She had not intended this. She had not, if she was honest, entirely believed it was possible that she could arrive somewhere as a stranger under circumstances that were about duty and necessity and find herself standing in it 3 months later, saying mine and knowing it was true. "Don't stay because of me," Marcus had written. "Only stay if you want to." She stood in the kitchen and felt with a clarity that was almost physical that the two halves of that instruction had finally become the same thing. When Callum came in at midday, she told him about Morrow, plainly fully including what she had said. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her and said with a quietness that held something she was not yet going to try to name, "You said my home." He nodded once. That single deliberate nod she had come to understand meant "I see you," the same one he had given her in the yard on the very first day when they had stood 10 feet apart and assessed what they had each walked into. He went back outside. She made lunch. The wind came through the kitchen window, carrying the smell of the east pasture, the newly mended fence, the land that was still his because of a margin they were now managing together. Outside, somewhere across the yard, she heard the sound of Pip reading aloud haltingly carefully, the way children read when they are learning and are trying very hard and have not yet learned to be self-conscious about the effort. She stood at the window and listened to the boy read, and listened to the wind in the grass, and felt the particular weight of a life that was slowly and with great effort, and no ceremony whatsoever, becoming something she had not known she was looking for. She went back to the stove. That, too, was a choice. Small, unremarked, made the way all the most consequential choices were made, not in the bright light of a moment of revelation, but in the ordinary course of an ordinary afternoon, quietly, and without any audience at all. The morning after Morrow's third visit, Callum was gone before first light. Wren woke to the particular silence of a house with only one person in it. She had learned to distinguish this from other silences the way you learn to distinguish one bird call from another after you have been listening long enough. She lay still for a moment, then dressed and went to the kitchen. The stove was cold. He had not made coffee, which meant he had left very early before the pre-dawn hour when he usually began his day. She made the coffee herself and stood at the window and looked out at the yard in the pale gray light of very early morning. Thursday was in the paddock. The barn door was closed but not latched, which meant he had taken his own horse and gone out onto the land somewhere. She did not know where. She did not ask Walt, who arrived at his usual hour, and said nothing about Callum's absence in the way that a man who has worked for another man a long time says nothing about the things that are not his to explain. She taught Pip his lesson. She made bread. She walked the herb beds she had started along the south wall of the house, assessing what had taken hold and what had not. She did the things that made up a day, and she waited without quite admitting to herself that she was waiting. He came back in the late afternoon. She heard his horse in the yard and did not go to the window. He came inside, moved through the main room, and went to the office. The door did not close this time. She understood this as a signal or something close enough to one. She gave him an hour. Then she poured 2 cups of coffee and walked down the hall. He was sitting at the desk with the papers from his last conversation with Morrow laid out in front of him, not reading them, just sitting with them the way a man sits with a thing he has been avoiding and has finally decided to stop avoiding. He looked up when she came in. She set a cup beside the papers and took the chair by the window. "Tell me," she said. He looked at the papers, at his hands, then at her. 2 more ranchers sold this week, he said. I heard it in the north pasture this morning from a man passing through. He paused. That leaves 4 of us between here and the ridge, 4 who haven't signed. His voice was level, but the levelness was the effortful kind. Morrow doesn't need all of us. He needs enough to make the project viable. 4 ranches spread out the way we are. We're the inconvenient middle of something he can build around us. Or he can wait. Wait for what? For the inconvenience to become more than we can manage. He looked at the window. A bad season. A broken piece of equipment we can't afford to replace. A winter that runs long. He doesn't need to pressure us directly. He just needs to be patient. Wren held her cup. The east pasture will be fully usable by spring. The margin changes then. I know. He said it without the satisfaction she had expected from that knowledge, without the relief she thought it would produce. Instead, he said it the way a man says something he believes to be true, but which is not sufficient. But spring is not now. And Morrow has... He stopped. He looked at her directly. This was something she had come to watch for the moments when he made himself look directly rather than at the middle distance. They were the moments when he was about to say something real. He has time, Callum said. And I am starting to understand that I don't. The room was very quiet. What does that mean? He stood up, moved to the window, stood with his back to her, looking out at the land in the failing light. It means that I've been managing this ranch alone for 3 years, and I know how to do that. I know every part of what that costs. He paused. And I am starting to understand that there are costs I didn't account for, because I didn't know what I was missing until I had something to compare it to. Ren was very still. He did not turn around. When Renata left, I told myself it was proof that this place could only hold one kind of person, that the solitude was built into it, that needing someone here was a failing of will. A long pause. I believed that for 3 years. I was very committed to believing it. Outside, the last light was going from the sky. And now, Ren said. Her voice was steady. She was working to keep it that way. He turned around. In the lamplight, his face was doing the thing it rarely did, letting her see all of it, not performing composure, not keeping the careful distance that had been his mode since the first day. Just his face and what was in it, and no wall between them and it. And now, he said, I am afraid. She had heard him say this word once before, briefly in passing, the way a man mentions a thing and immediately covers it over. This was different. This was the word standing alone in the open, unqualified, undisguised. Afraid of what? She said, quietly. The way you speak to something that has come out of shelter and might go back in. He looked at her. Afraid that I've let something start that I don't know how to finish without losing it. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It had the quality of a silence after something important has been said, not requiring a response, immediately requiring only to be sat with, long enough for its full weight to settle. But Ren's response when it came was not what either of them expected. She said, What are you actually saying to me, Callum? Not harshly, but directly with the quiet precision of a woman who had spent enough time translating his silences and his indirections that she was no longer willing to do it for him. He was capable of saying the real thing. She had heard it from him before. She was asking him to do it again. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm saying that you matter here, he said. That you have mattered here for longer than I've been willing to admit. That I watch you ride out to the east field and come back and He stopped. His jaw tightened. He started again. I've spent 3 years building a life that doesn't require anyone, and I've done it so thoroughly that I don't know anymore whether I'm being careful or whether I've simply taught myself to be alone. Because it's safer than the alternative. Ren stood up. She did not move toward him, not yet. She stood beside the chair and held her cup, and looked at him from the distance of a few feet, which felt in that moment like either a very large distance or a very small one. And the alternative, she said. What does that look like to you? He held her gaze. Like something I could wreck, the way I wrecked it before. You didn't wreck it before. She left because she was unhappy. Those are different things. I made her unhappy. You were yourself, Ren said. That's not the same as making someone unhappy. People make themselves unhappy by wanting someone to be different than they are. She paused. I have not once wished you were different than you are. The last sentence landed differently than the others. She heard it land, saw it in his face, the slight widening, the almost imperceptible catch in his breath. She had not entirely intended to say it, but she was not going to take it back. He crossed the distance between them, not quickly, not dramatically, just deliberately, the way he did everything covering the ground between the window and where she stood until he was close enough that she could see the small scar along his jaw. The way the lamplight caught the gray beginning at his temples, the particular expression of a man who has reached the edge of the thing he has been managing the approach to for a long time. He stopped, close enough that the air between them was a different kind of air. "Ren," he said, "I don't know how to do this," he said without, and then his voice broke, not elaborately. Just a single crack in the careful construction there and gone, but she heard it, and it undid her more completely than any polished declaration could have, because it was real and unintended, and because she understood what it had cost him to let her hear it. She reached up and placed her palm against his jaw. Warm skin, the scratch of stubble, the slight tension of a man trying very hard to hold still. "I know," she said. "I don't either." What happened after was not a resolution. She would understand this later, clearly the way you understand in retrospect the difference between a turning and an arrival. What happened after was that he put his hand over hers, the hand she had placed against his jaw, and held it there for a moment before stepping back, and she let him because she understood that this was the pace of it and that the pace was right. But something had shifted, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it was its own kind of arrival. She went to her room. She lay on her bed and stared at the ceiling for a long time. She thought about the carved box on the table beside her, about the letter inside it, about Marcus who had done an impossible thing out of love and had somehow impossibly been right. She thought she understood what he had meant by without wrecking it, without losing her, without letting himself need this enough that it destroyed him when it went. And then she thought, he doesn't know that yet. He needs to learn it from evidence, not from promises. He is the kind of man who believes what he can observe, and you cannot observe something that hasn't happened yet. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the grass. The land was dark and wide and entirely indifferent, and it was hers, and that was still strange. And it was also, she thought, beginning to be simply true. The blow came 3 days later. It did not come from Morrow. She had been watching, for Morrow had been tracking his direction and his logic and the shape of his patience, and so she had been looking the wrong way when it came. It came from Walt. He appeared at the kitchen door on a gray mid-morning hat in hand with the expression of a man who has been preparing what he is about to say for longer than the walk from the barn. Wren knew the expression. She had seen it on students who had something difficult to confess on Marcus in the final weeks when he was trying to find the right time for conversations that did not have a right time. She put down the knife she was using and turned to face him fully. Walt was not a man of excess words. He said it plainly. His sister in a distant settlement had been seriously hurt and needed him. He needed to go. He did not know for how long. He was sorry. He had told Callum already. She thanked him. She told him to go without worrying about the ranch. She meant it. He left 2 days later, and Pip went with him, and the quiet they left behind was of a different quality than the quiet that had existed before. Less the quiet of a small household, more the quiet of an absence. The work increased. Not catastrophically, they could manage and did, but the days became longer, and the margin for anything beyond the immediate demands of the ranch compressed to something very thin. Wren took on tasks she had not done before: feeding the livestock in the mornings, checking the water lines, learning the small and specific logic of systems she had observed but not operated. She made mistakes and corrected them. She did not complain about the mistakes or about the learning. Callum worked harder than she had seen him work, even before the particular quality of effort that comes from a person who is accustomed to carrying the full weight of a thing and has slipped back into that mode without fully intending to. She saw it in the set of his shoulders at supper, in the way he ate quickly and said little and went to bed early and rose before the light. She saw something else too. She saw him pulling back. It was subtle, so subtle that she might have missed it if she had not been paying the kind of attention she had been paying for months now. The way he managed the small distances. At supper, the chair pulled slightly further from the table than usual, which put more space between them. In conversation, shorter answers, quicker retreat from anything that moved toward the territory they had been entering. The hands that had held hers in the office, the voice that had broken on without those, were still there in his face. When he looked at her, she could see them, but he was covering them over again slowly, with the careful patience of a man relaying a floor. She watched this for 4 days before she said anything. She waited for an evening when the work was done and supper was cleared, and he had settled at the table with the ledger, their ledger, now the one they looked at together, the thing that had been a point of shared territory between them. She sat across from him and watched him work the numbers in silence for a while. Then she said, "You're pulling away." He did not look up immediately. The pause before he did was too long to be natural. "I'm managing the ranch," he said. "You're managing the ranch and you're pulling away. Both things are true." He looked up then. His face was doing the careful thing, the composed thing, the thing she had learned to see through. "Walt leaving put more on both of us," he said. "There's less time for what?" she said, quietly. "For the thing you said in the office 3 days ago." A silence. Wren. "Don't say my name to end a conversation," she said. "I've noticed that's what you do. You say my name, and then you wait for me to let it go." She held his gaze. "I'm not going to let it go." He set down the pencil. He looked at her with the expression she had seen in the office, the open one, the one without the wall, and also with something layered on top of it that was newer and more complicated. "Walt left," he said. "The work doubled. I am trying to keep this ranch from," he stopped, reformulated. "I am trying to make sure that what you said tomorrow, that this is your home, is still true in 6 months. That it's still standing. That it hasn't slipped through my hands because I was..." He stopped again. "Because you were what?" His jaw tightened. "Because I was distracted." Wren looked at him for a long moment. "You think caring about someone is a distraction?" "I think caring about someone while the ranch is under pressure and my only hired hand has left and the east fence is only half done." Callum. She said his name the way he said hers, to stop a sentence, not to end a conversation. He stopped. She leaned forward slightly, her forearms on the table. "Caring about someone is not what makes a ranch fail. You know that. You have always known that. You're using it as a reason because the real reason is harder to say." The fire crackled. The lamp put its light on his face. "And what is the real reason?" he said. Flat, not a question. "The real reason," Wren said, "is that 3 days ago you said something you've never said to anyone, and it didn't go wrong, and that is more frightening to you than any of the things that go wrong." He was very still. She held his gaze and did not look away. "You've learned how to manage loss. You are extremely good at it. You are not good at managing the possibility that something won't be lost. That is the thing that is frightening you. Not the work, not Walt leaving, not Morrow." She paused. "Me." Still here, not leaving. The silence that followed was the longest they had sat in together, longer than the ones in the early weeks, which had been the silence of strangers being careful. This was the silence of two people being honest about something large. Callum looked at the table, at the ledger, at his hands. Then he looked up at her with the expression that had no performance in it, the one she had learned to wait for, and she saw in it something she had not seen before. Not just the opening she had been watching develop over months, but underneath it, held carefully like something fragile hope. The specific, terrified hope of a person who has been without something for long enough that they have forgotten they were allowed to want it. I watched you ride back from the east field this morning, he said. His voice was low. And I thought, he stopped, breathed. I thought, this is the thing I've been afraid of. Not losing the ranch, losing this. This. His hand moved slightly, indicating the space between them, the table, the lamp, the whole accumulated weight of the months since she'd arrived. This is what I've been building walls around. Wren did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, then stop. I don't know if I can. You do, she said. You know exactly how. You leave tea outside a door without being asked. You keep a plate warm for someone who's been at a sick child's side all day. You install a lock that no one asked you to install because you wanted someone to feel safe. Her voice was steady, and she kept it that way because she needed it to be. You know how to let someone matter, Callum. You've been doing it the whole time. You've just been telling yourself a different story about it. He looked at her for a very long time. Outside, the wind moved through the grass in the dark, the endless, patient movement of it, the land going on in every direction without concern for the two people inside the small lit house at its center. I don't want to wreck it, he said finally. Not the finished version of what he had started to say in the office, better than that, realer than that. I don't want to be the thing that makes this stop being what it is. You're not, she said. I'm not fragile. I'm not Renata. I'm not going to leave because the land is hard or the work is heavy or because you need more time alone than other people. She leaned forward the last inch. I am the person who sat outside your door at 2 a.m. because you were awake in there, and I didn't want you to be alone in it. That is who I am. That is not going to change because you said something true in an office and it scared you. The fire settled. The lamp burned steady. Callum's hands flat on the table, turned over slowly, deliberately, palms up. The smallest gesture. The most particular kind of asking. Wren looked at his hands. Then she reached across the table and placed both of hers in his. His fingers closed. Warm, calloused, careful. They sat like that for a long time. The table between them, the lamp between them, the ledger with its changing numbers, the window showing the dark and the land, and the sky full of stars over all of it. And neither of them said anything more, because there was nothing more that needed to be said that was not already being said by the simple fact of two pairs of hands together on a table in the light. Outside, a meadowlark called late in the evening, which was unusual. Wren heard it. She thought she felt Callum's grip shift slightly in response to it, just a small increase of pressure there, and then steady, as if saying, I hear it too. I'm still here. She held on. That was how the wall came down. Not with drama. Not with a single decisive moment of arrival. With a ledger on a table, and a lamp burning low, and two people who had spent months learning the shape of each other, finally sitting in the same room, without pretending that they hadn't. Some things, when they finally happen, are exactly what they were always going to be. Quiet and particular and entirely sufficient. This was one of those things. The days that followed were different, not in any way that announced itself. The work was the same, the land was the same. What had changed was something interior. The angle of everything shifted. The way a single stone moved in an archway redistributes the pressure through every other stone. She noticed this the first morning after the night at the table. She was at the stove when he came in from the early feeding, and she heard him stop just inside the door, and she knew, without turning around, that he was looking at her. She had felt that particular quality of attention before, and had learned to wait for him to look away before she turned, because the looking away was part of how he managed it. And she had understood that the managing needed to be respected. But this time, she turned before he looked away. He met her gaze. He did not look away. She held up the coffee pot. He crossed the kitchen and held out his cup, and she poured, and their hands were very close together in the space over the cup, and neither of them moved back. He took the cup. He said, "Thank you." Those two words in his mouth with that particular quality, the quality of a person meaning something larger than the sentence they have said. "You're welcome," she said in kind. He sat down at the table. She sat across from him. They drank their coffee in the morning light and did not say anything else, and it was the best conversation she could remember having in a long time. The letter from Morrow came on a Thursday. Not a visit this time, a letter which was in some ways more final. The kind of communication a man sends when he has decided that the negotiating phase is over, and it is time to state the situation plainly. Callum brought it in from where the occasional writer left correspondence at the gatepost, set it on the table without opening it, and stood looking at it in the way he stood looking at things he was preparing himself to deal with. Wren came and stood beside him. She looked at the envelope, then at his face. "Together," she said. Morrow had written clearly and without malice, which was almost worse than if he had written with it. The language of the letter was the language of inevitability. He was proceeding with development on the adjacent parcels. The infrastructure would be built regardless of the remaining 4 ranches, and the offer he had made was being formally withdrawn at the end of the month. After that date, should any remaining ranch wish to sell, negotiations would begin fresh and at a significantly reduced figure, since the location would by then be less strategically valuable to the project. He wished them well. Callum set the letter down. Wren read it again more slowly, parsing the specific language. Then she set it down too. "The end of the month," she said. 18 days. She looked at the window, at the land beyond it, at the east pasture. She could just see from this angle the fence that was finished, now the pasture that was usable, now the margin that had changed. "What do you want to do?" He looked at her. "I want to keep it." "Then we keep it." "Wren." His voice had the particular quality it got when he was about to say the thing beneath the thing. "If we don't sell and the project goes ahead around us, the next few years will be hard. Not impossible, but hard. I know. You know in the way you know a thing before you've lived through it," he said, not unkindly, honestly. "That's different from knowing it after." She looked at him steadily. "Then I'll know it after. That's how most things get learned." She paused. "Is that what you're asking me? Whether I understand what staying means?" "I'm asking whether you're choosing it," he said. "Fully. Not because of the letter. And not because of the contract, and not because of... He stopped, and she saw him make himself finish the sentence. Not because of what happened between us at that table. I'm asking whether if you subtract all of those things, you still want to be here. It was the most honest question anyone had ever asked her. She took her time with it. She did not answer immediately, because he deserved a real answer, and real answers required the space to find their actual shape, rather than the first shape that presented itself. She thought about the morning she had found the lock on her door. She thought about Thursday, the mare who had finally allowed Wren to bridle her without supervision, which had taken 6 weeks and felt like a significant accomplishment. She thought about Pip's face the first time he had read a full sentence without stopping. She thought about the creek bank and the yarrow and the willow and the way Callum had crouched beside her in the wet grass and listened to her explain what grew there and why. She thought about the ledger, about bread, about tea left outside a door in the dark. She thought about the word home and the fact that she had said it to Silas Morrow without calculation as a simple statement of fact, the way you state facts that have been true long enough to require no defense. Yes, she said. I'm choosing it. I've been choosing it for a while now. I just didn't know when exactly I started until you asked me to look back and find it. Callum was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up the letter, folded it, and put it in the stove. They stood and watched it catch and burn. All right, he said. Then we send our own letter. The 4 remaining ranchers met on a gray morning at the largest of their properties, which belonged to a woman named Dora Fitch, 70 years old, as wide as she was tall, and possessed of an intelligence so thorough it had long since dispensed with the need to perform itself. She had outlasted 2 husbands and a drought that had broken everyone around her, and she received the assembled ranchers in her kitchen with the hospitality of a woman who had learned that good coffee and plain speaking saved more time than any amount of ceremony. Dora walked them out. At the door, she caught Wren's arm briefly a firm and unhurried grip and looked at her with the assessing eyes of a woman who had spent 70 years learning to read people accurately. You're the reason this meeting happened, Dora said. It was not a compliment exactly. It was an observation delivered straight the way Dora apparently delivered everything. That's worth knowing about yourself. Wren held her gaze. The meeting was worth having. That's what matters. Dora made a small sound of either approval or amusement with Dora. It was difficult to distinguish, and released her arm and went back inside. On the ride home, Callum was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was thinking, rather than withdrawn the thinking silence, rather than the managing silence. And Wren had long since learned not to fill the thinking silence with anything. The land moved past them wide and cold and pale, under the overcast sky, the grass flattened by wind, the distant line of hills, faint as a suggestion at the edge of the world. After a long while, he said without looking at her, "My father lost his land." She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the distance. He held it for 20 years, and then he lost it in a single bad season. Not because he wasn't careful. He was careful. He lost it because he was alone in the bad season, and there was no one to hold the other side of it while he held his. A pause. He never recovered from that. Not the land, the losing of it. It took something out of him that didn't come back. The horses moved. The wind moved. The land moved past in its vast, unhurried way. I think I've been afraid of that, he said, for a very long time. Not the losing of the land specifically, the losing of the thing I'd given myself to, the particular kind of breaking that comes from that. Wren was quiet for a moment. And now, he turned and looked at her on horseback in the gray light, with the wind moving his collar and the distance behind him. He looked at her with the open expression, the one without the wall. Now, he said, I think I understand the difference between holding something alone and holding it with someone. I think my father was right that you cannot hold certain things alone forever. I think I just needed to learn it from my own evidence. You are extremely committed to learning things from your own evidence, Wren said. Something crossed his face, the ghost of a smile, moving quickly but real. Yes. I find that I don't mind it, she said, as a quality. He looked at her for another moment. Then he faced forward again, and they rode home side by side in the gray light, close enough that their stirrups occasionally touched, and neither of them moved apart. Morrow's deadline passed without event. The morning after it passed, Wren woke to the particular quality of light that meant clear sky and early frost, and she lay still for a moment, simply registering it, the light, the cold. The fact of the morning after the deadline, the fact of the ranch still standing, and the decision still made, and the consequences of the decision still ahead of them, not resolved, not simple, but chosen. She got up, she dressed, she went to the kitchen. Callum was already there at the stove, which was unusual. He had coffee ready, which was less unusual, and he was making something else, working at the counter with the particular focused concentration he brought to tasks he was doing for the first time, or had not done in a while. She came to stand beside him and looked at the work. He was making bread. She looked at the bread. She looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the dough with the expression of a man applying full attention to a task he did not entirely trust himself to execute correctly. Bet told you your bread came out like river rock, Wren said. It does, he said. That hasn't changed. I'm attempting to see if it can. She looked at the dough. It was not entirely wrong. The consistency was better than she might have expected. You've been practicing, she said. A pause. Some. When? Early mornings, when you were still asleep. He still did not look at her. I wasted some flour. Walt's flour supply, technically. I'll account for it. Wren stood very still beside him at the counter. She understood what she was looking at, a man practicing a thing in private in the early dark without audience or acknowledgement, because he had decided to learn it. Not because anyone had asked him to, because it was something that was done in a life shared with another person, and he was trying to learn the shape of that life. She did not say any of this. She simply reached past him and made a small adjustment to how he was folding the dough, the same motion she had made 100 times herself, muscle memory, the knowledge in the hands. His hands stopped. He looked at hers doing the thing she was showing him. Then he resumed replicating the motion. Better. There, she said. He nodded. She moved to the other side of the kitchen and began the rest of the breakfast, and they worked in the kitchen together in the early light with the frost on the windows and the fire in the stove and the smell of bread beginning, and it was ordinary. And it was extraordinary, and it was simply what the morning was. Walt came back with Pip when the season had shifted again, arriving quietly the way Walt did most things, without announcement and without ceremony. His sister had mended. Pip had grown what seemed like an inch in the weeks he'd been gone, and he came through the kitchen door and went immediately to the shelf where Wren kept the books she used for his lessons, with the purposefulness of a child returning to interrupted business. Wren stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Pip extract the reader they had left off on and settle at the table with it, and she felt something she could not immediately name, a fullness, a particular kind of rightness, the feeling of a thing fitting the shape it was meant to fit. That evening, Callum set the bread on the table. It was not perfect. The bottom was slightly darker than ideal, and the rise was uneven on one side. But it was recognizably bread. It held its shape. It had crust. It was the product of a sustained effort that had reached a point of basic adequacy. Pip reached for a piece immediately, which was the most honest assessment available. Walt took a piece without comment, which was his version of approval. Wren took a piece and held it for a moment before eating it, feeling the weight of it, the particular texture. She looked at Callum across the table. He was looking at the bread with the critical expression of a man assessing his own work, already identifying what needed to improve. "Better than river rock," she said. He looked up, the ghost of the smile slightly more present than usual. "Marginally." "Substantially," she said. Bet would revise her opinion. Bet wouldn't admit to revising her opinion. "No," Wren agreed. But she would eat 2 pieces and say nothing, which with Bet is the same thing. Pip, who had been listening to this exchange with the alert attention of a child who finds adults interesting when they are being funny, laughed a genuine laugh, sudden and uncomplicated. The laugh of a child who has been given permission to find something funny. Callum looked at Pip, then at Wren. Something moved through his face, the fullness she had felt earlier, reflected back the same recognition of a thing fitting its shape. He looked down at his plate, but the ghost of the smile stayed longer than usual. She saw it there while he ate, returning at the edges, and she did not point it out, because some things were better left to exist on their own terms without being named. The letter she wrote to Marcus was not something she had planned to write. She had thought about it sometimes, the act of writing to someone who could not receive a letter, the strange comfort some people found in it. It had always seemed to her like a performance of grief, rather than a genuine engagement with it, and she was not a woman who performed things even for herself. But one evening in late season, when the light was doing something particular through the west window, the long golden light of a sun going down behind clouds, turning everything amber and slow, she found herself at the small table in her room with paper in front of her and a pen in her hand, without having entirely decided to be there. She wrote for a while, not long, not elaborately. She told him about the ranch and the east pasture and the fence that had changed the margin. She told him about Thursday the mare and what it felt like to ride out to the creek alone in the early morning, with the frost still on the grass. She told him about Pip and the reader they were halfway through, and what it sounded like when a child read aloud with confidence for the first time. She told him about Callum. "You were right," she wrote. "I don't know how you knew. I think you saw something about me that I hadn't finished seeing about myself. That is a very Marcus thing to have done. I am furious about it, and I am grateful for it, and I expect I will keep being both of those things for a very long time. I'm staying. Not because of you, you told me not to stay because of you, and I listened. I'm staying because I want to. That took longer to learn than it should have, probably. But I know it now." She set the pen down, sat for a moment with the letter in front of her reading it back. Then she folded it and placed it in the carved box on top of the other letter, the one Marcus had written to her. 2 letters now in the same box, his and hers. A conversation that had been conducted across an impossible distance and had nevertheless somehow arrived. She closed the box, set it back on the table, blew out the lamp, and sat for a moment in the dark. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with its constant patient authority. The land was dark and the sky was enormous, and the stars were the stars she had been learning by name since she arrived, making a study of them the way she made a study of everything she found herself in the middle of. She had the names of most of them now. The evening she would think of later as the real beginning, not the letter, not the kitchen, not the hands at the table, but the real beginning. The one that settled began with nothing more than the end of an ordinary day. The work was done. Supper was cleared. Walt and Pip were in their cabin. The house was quiet in the way the house was quiet now. Not the solitary quiet of before, but the quiet of two people who had found a way to occupy the same space without either of them being diminished by it. Callum was on the porch. She knew this without looking. Knew the sound of his particular stillness when he was outside in the evening. The slight shift of the boards, the specific quality of presence that carried through the walls of the house in a way she could no longer explain practically, but knew to be true. He was leaning on the porch rail, looking at the sky. The last light was gone, but the dark was not yet fully dark, that brief interval between the two. The sky still holding a thin line of deep blue along the western edge, like a thought not quite finished. Stars emerging one by one in the higher dark the way they always did, quietly and without announcement. She stood beside him. Their arms were close on the rail but not touching. The night air was cold enough to be clear, cold enough to give the stars their particular winter brightness. She said, albeit non-obiate. He turned his head to look at her. Latin, she said. Gravestone inscription. It means he is gone, but not dead. Or more precisely, he has departed, but has not perished. She looked at the stars. I learned it from a book I had when I was teaching. I used to think it was a comfort people told themselves, something to make the leaving bearable. A pause. I think I understand it differently now. He was quiet beside her. He's still in things, she said. Marcus, he's in the way I read a plant to understand what it's good for. He's in the way I sit with a child who's struggling and wait instead of rushing to the answer. He's in the box on my table. She paused. He's in the reason I'm standing on this porch. She felt Callum shift a small movement, the adjustment of a man who is listening with his whole body. I used to feel that as loss, she said. The being in things, like a kind of haunting, like I was carrying him and the carrying was the grief. She looked at the line of deep blue at the western edge fading as she watched. It's not that anymore. I don't know exactly when it changed. What is it now? Callum said. Low. Careful. She thought about it honestly because he deserved honesty and she had come to expect nothing less from herself with him. It's like the difference between carrying something and being shaped by it. What you carry is a burden. What shapes you is just part of what you are. She paused. He shaped me. He knew me well enough and loved me enough to point me in a direction I wouldn't have found on my own. And now the direction is just where I am. It doesn't feel like carrying anymore. Callum was quiet for a long time. Then he said, My father's watch is in the drawer by the bed. I've never worn it, he said. I took it after he died, and I put it in the drawer, and I've opened the drawer enough times to know it's there. I never took it out. He was looking at the sky, not at her. I think I thought if I wore it, I'd wear the loss of him, the way he ended, the land, all of it. A pause. I haven't been willing to do that. But, she said. He turned and looked at her, in the dark, in the last of the fading light with the first stars bright overhead. But you made me understand something, he said, about the difference between what you carry and what shapes you. I didn't have language for it before you said it just now, but I think I've been learning it for a while. She held his gaze. He would have liked this, Callum said, not performing sentiment, saying a plain thing plainly. The east fence, Pip learning to read, the bread that isn't river rock anymore. His eyes were steady on hers. He would have understood why I'm not letting it go. Wren's chest did something complicated and quiet. She did not try to stop it. I think, she said, that the people who shape us tend to recognize each other, even when they've never met. He reached out, then slowly giving her time to understand what was coming, and took her hand where it rested on the porch rail, his palm warm over her knuckles, the familiar calluses, the careful grip. She turned her hand over and held on. They stood like that for a long time. The stars came out fully, the whole of them, the winter sky dense with light. The land spread out in all directions, and the dark patient and enormous, holding the cold with the same equanimity with which it held the heat, enduring the way things endure when they have been in a place long enough to belong to it. After a while she said, Callum, ask me. A silence. She felt his hand tighten slightly on hers. Wren, he said, will you stay? Not will you marry me? Not an arrangement or a contract or a renegotiation of terms. Will you stay? The precise and particular question, the one that contained everything else inside it, the one that could only be asked between two people who understood exactly what staying meant. Yes, she said. And then, because it was true, and because he deserved to hear it said directly without qualification or management, I've been staying for a while now. I'm just telling you. So you know I know it. His exhale was long and slow beside her, the exhale of a person setting down something they have been carrying for a very long time. Not dramatically, just the ordinary release of held breath. She felt it in the hand that held hers. They stood on the porch in the cold and the dark, while the stars did their indifferent and magnificent work overhead, and the land held them the way land holds the things placed on it, without sentiment, without ceremony, without any particular care for the smallness of two people in the middle of all that space. But it held them. The morning after the first morning, after she woke to the sound of him in the kitchen, not unfamiliar, but different now, carrying a different weight, or perhaps she was carrying it differently. She lay still and listened to the ordinary sounds, the stove, the coffee, the particular movement of a man who had been up since before the light, doing the things that needed doing. She got up. She dressed. She walked down the hall to the kitchen. He had the coffee ready, as he always did. He was at the window looking out at the land in the thin early light, the frost on the grass, the pale sky, the east pasture where the fence was finished, and the margin had changed. He heard her come in and did not turn immediately in the way he had always not turned immediately, but the quality of the not turning was different now. Not the careful management of a man holding distance. Just a man looking at his land before he looked at his morning. She poured her coffee and came to stand beside him at the window. The east pasture was pale with frost, the grass silvered, and still the fence line straight and true across the distance. Beyond it, the land went on to the horizon in the way it always did, enormous, unchanged entirely itself. Pip will want his lesson this morning, she said. He was up before I was, Callum said. I heard him in the barn trying to read the feed labels. He can read the feed labels now, Wren said. He read them to me last week. Something moved through Callum's face, that particular warmth, the one that lived in his eyes more than his mouth. He told me. He sounded like a man reporting an accomplishment. "It is an accomplishment," she said. "He worked for it." They stood at the window together, watching the light change over the land, the slow brightening of a winter morning, the frost beginning to lift off the grass as the air warmed the long, patient process of a day beginning. "There's work on the north fence this week," he said. "I know. I saw it when I rode out Tuesday. I thought we could do the east section first, while the ground's still hard enough to hold the posts." "That's the right order," she said. A pause. The light on the frost. The steam rising from their cups. "Wren," he said. He did not say anything else immediately. She waited in the way she had learned to wait, not impatiently, not bracing for something, just present in the waiting, which was its own kind of thing. "Abiet non obiet," he said. His Latin was uncertain, the pronunciation shaped by a man who had learned it just this morning from a phrase heard the night before and not forgotten. "Is that right?" She looked at him. His eyes were on the land. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly right." The sun came over the edge of the world, and fully without gradation the way mornings came in that country, and the frost caught the light and held it for a moment, each blade of grass, a small bright thing, the whole of the east pasture, brilliant and particular and entirely sufficient. And then the moment passed, and it was simply morning, ordinary and enormous, beginning the way every morning began. Callum set down his cup and went to put his coat on. Wren stayed at the window for a moment longer. Outside, the land went on in every direction, his land, her land, their land, whatever it was, becoming patient and indifferent, and holding everything placed on it with the same steady disregard for whether those things were lost or found, or just at last home. She set down her cup. She went to get her coat. That was how it was. That was how it would be.